right, let's get started. Welcome. I'm Peter Borman from the Central Plateau Cleanup Company. Thank you for joining us for tonight's public meeting. For full disclosure, we are transcribing the meeting and recording it, and the recording will be posted on the Hanford.gov events calendar after the meeting. Great to see everyone in person. Great to see everybody on our online audience as well. Just a quick logistics safety check before we get going here. For those of us here in the room, just please note the exit closest to you in case the unlikely event we have to leave quickly, but there's one right here behind these screens, obviously out here to the door to your immediate left. And then if you need the restroom, all the way down the hall on your right. Oh. All right, let's talk about the meeting. Tonight's meeting is on a proposed revision to the plan to clean up soil under Hanford's 324 building. So this is called the 300-296 waste site. As we'll hear more about in a minute, the U.S. Department of Energy recently completed a study that evaluated different cleanup approaches for the site and has presented two alternatives to the Environmental Protection Agency, including a preferred alternative. So we'll hear more in detail about the study and the alternatives. We have representatives here tonight from DOE and EPA to discuss the plans going forward. And I'd like to introduce our panel. So we'll start with a presentation from Ben Vanna with the U.S. Department of Energy. And following Ben's presentation, we'll hear from Annie McCartney from the Environmental Protection Agency, and EPA is the lead regulator on this project. So after we hear from Ben and Annie, the remainder of the meeting will be dedicated to questions from both our in-person and our online audiences. I want to note that this meeting is tied to a public comment period about the proposed changes. So that comment period began on June 9th and it runs through August 18th. And while the agencies are not taking formal public comment at the meeting, we do hope that the discussion tonight helps inform any comments you may have before the end of the comment period, or you may wish to submit. Before we get started, I also want to mention that Colleen Drinkard is on our online chat, so we'll be hearing from her. Those online will be hearing from her when we get to the Q&A. When we get there, I'll talk a little bit more about the logistics and how that's going to work. But without further ado, Ben, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Peter. So I can point out our slides and talk tonight. So once again, Ben Vanna, U.S. Department of Energy. I'll be talking through our proposed plans tonight for amending our 300 area ROD. Purpose is we're explaining the proposed change to the public. So the goal for tonight is for everybody to have a good understanding of what we're proposing. Do you agree it's a safe and effective path forward? And because before we finalize our decision, we require public feedback. So before we pick something, we do consider your feedback. In terms of the agenda, some of us are not familiar with the 324 project and building. I'll be talking through that. And discovery of change conditions that led us here tonight. And all alternative approaches that were considered, why we picked a preferred alternative, the reasons for selecting that based on the criteria and the regulations. And just some reassurances. We'll talk to the groundwater monitoring program that is ongoing around the building in the groundwater below. And then a kind of a question and answer session for public comment. So the 324 building, it's located in this portion of the Hanford site. The yellow is the Hanford site, so we're down in the southeast corner, pretty close to town, near the Columbia River. Historically, 324 building was used for research on nuclear materials. So going back, it was constructed in 1966 and supported some pretty cool programs. Eisenhower's Atoms for Peace program. So after the World War II, what else can we use nuclear material for? It's the energy of the future. So it supported some of that. Some of you may be familiar with the high-level waste or treatment project out there, W2B, and vitrifying some high-level waste on site. Well, the 324 building actually supported vitrification experiments way before that. So it does have a pretty cool history. And as Dieter explained, 300-296 waste site, that is the contaminated soil below the building, just so you're familiar with that nomenclature. And the building foundation completely covers the waste site. It's not getting to groundwater. Over the past number of decades of monitoring, haven't seen any movement there. So over the 30 years of that operations occurred at the building for the research, some events did happen. That's what brings us here today. So back in 2009, we're getting the building ready for demolition. And the scientists, when they did their experiments, they did them in hot cells, these rather large rooms, use robotic arms to move stuff around, control the experiments. And in the case of the B hot cell, very large room with the robotic arms, cranes to move stuff around. As they were done with experiments, stuff would drop to the bottom of the cell, which is about 30 feet tall. And the bottom of the hot cell looked kind of like a teenager's room. There was debris all over, couldn't quite see the floor back in the 80s, 90s. And so as part of the cleanup effort in 2009, removing that debris, and they found a hole in the floor of the hot cell. And that's not something you want to find when you're cleaning up a hot cell where they did research on nuclear materials. So the next step, they went to go investigate, could anything have gotten through the floor of the hot cell into the soil below? And that's what that picture captures. So they pushed some probes deep beneath the building under the hot cell, checking for essentially radiation signatures. And they did find some right below B cell. So B cell, as I explained, very large structure, concrete walls, 4 to 5 foot thick. So very protective area. As they're pushing these probes through, checking for radiation, you just imagine the probe going through the soil. And as it got below the footer, there's actually a seam here that connects the floor to the wall. And there's a felt liner there. So kind of if you're walking down the sidewalk, that little felt liner between the concrete slabs, that's essentially what was right there. And they found some radiation. And where did that come from? So back in 1986, if you remember the vitrification experiments I was talking about, they were performing that, and they had a highly concentrated solution of cesium and strontium, and it actually had negative pH, so very acidic. And when they overflowed the melter, essentially, about 500 liters of the cesium and strontium collected on the floor, made its way down to a low point, a sump, where it actually ate the stainless steel liner and made its way into the soil. So as the probes are going through, it was essentially a curtain of contamination that wicked into that felt liner and went straight down into the soil. That's what there were 16 probes that were pushed between there. That's what they were reading back in 2011, 2013 timeframe. So between those joints, high contamination. Over here, no yellow. They weren't seeing any radiation. So what does that mean? Very minimal lateral spread. That's what they were finding. And what does that mean to us in terms of the approach that was developed? Well, if there's very little lateral movement, and they gave this data to PNML who did modeling, and PNML said, yep, about 3 feet down is your cesium, and then to about 8 feet down, that's where the bulk of your strontium is. Well, the plan was we can put a remote excavator arm attached to the wall, and that would allow us to make a hole in the floor and just dig that out. And why would we do it that way? Well, you're in the 324 building, which was specifically built for these experiments. It has all the shielding that you need, all the air filtration that you need, the technology to get stuff in and out of the hot cell. So that was the plan, rather than taking the building down and building a new structure over it. But as we, back in 2022, we found some changed conditions where some contamination was outside of the area that was suspected to be for those measurements. Next one, please. Perfect. So in 2022, as I was saying, we found some contamination outside of the zone we thought it was. So if you guys go to the beach and dig a hole, sand typically caves in and you got to dig more out. So with the approach that I was just talking about, if we're going to be digging out that contamination, we wanted to stabilize the soil around the hot cell. So we were going to be drilling over 200 holes around the hot cell, injecting some additive to the soil to bind it together. So it'd be pretty solid, essentially super glue the soil together so that you don't have clean soil falling into your excavation zone. You just want to target the hot stuff so you have less to dig. The other part of that is we need to stabilize the soil below the door, that hot cell. Because if you're digging out the soil and too much soil erodes from beneath your foundation, your cell could shift. Your door could get stuck either open or shut, and that would be a pretty big risk to the success of the project. So as we're doing the drilling below the hot cell, stabilizing the soil, we use that as an opportunity to collect dose rate readings, check for radiation. And that's what this figure is showing up here. So the green outer wall, that's the outside of B cell. The inner green box is the inside of B cell. When they were doing those 16, or had the 16 geoprobes, checking dose rate measurements under B cell, they were able to get to all these areas except this one right here due to an obstruction. We were able to get to that area in 2022. That's where we found some expanded contamination outside of the zone it was supposed to be. And the issue is that it's laterally farther than expected. So we could reach deeper with the technology we had, but we couldn't reach farther out to the side very easily. So that was a big change condition that we discovered. There were now one issue alone. We can figure out a way to resolve that. But there were some other criteria that caused us to decide to step back and reevaluate. So if we're going to be digging farther out, that contamination is actually in the zone that we're stabilizing the soil. So we'd have to redo our structural design for how we support B cell during the excavation. The other issue that caused us to reevaluate was buildings getting old. It was built in 1966. Some of the cranes, one of the cranes is actually original to the building. It's old enough to collect a pension. So the ventilation system, that's original. We're having to do a lot more repairs on there. So in order to assure the success of the project, we decided all this stuff that has started to fail rather frequently and unexpectedly, we'd want to go and replace that just so that you don't get partway through your excavation project and your crane dies and you got to go in and replace it. So there's a cost and time and worker risk associated with doing all that. So we said collectively, all these impacts, let's reevaluate if it's really the best path forward to go forward with our plan that was outlined in the record of decision. And then just as a reminder, some reassurances, haven't detected any movement of contamination down to groundwater. The building foundation does completely cover the waste site. And the only way your contamination in the soil is going to move is if water gets to it and mobilizes it down to groundwater. So the foundation covering it, it's not going anywhere. Why am I saying that? That gives just some reassurance that it's not immediately time sensitive. We have time to go out. It took us over a year to properly evaluate and figure out a proposed plan for dealing with this. So throughout this, I'll be talking about a retrieval enclosure. So why am I doing that? This isn't something that was originally envisioned in the ROD. So just since I will be talking about it, we wanted to put a visual to it. So what is a retrieval enclosure? We've used these on site and mainly in Idaho for waste retrieval. It can be a large tent with a membrane large enough to actually fit in excavation equipment for supporting the soil remediation. Why would you do that? So for the contaminants that are in the soil, if you're excavating, you don't want that dust to get into the air and get outside your excavation zone, potentially toward the public. So that tent would contain everything. It would have HEPA filtration. There would be a special airlock where the equipment can go in and out and be properly surveyed by workers. So that's just a safe way to conduct the remediation. Thank you very much. So I talked about the change conditions. As I mentioned, the original approach was to, you could actually go in, excavate all your high activity soil, and then there would just be low activity soil left, which after the building demolition, you target that open air. After the change condition, we determined we can't get all the high activity soil. There would still be high activity soil left. If you use those excavator arms to reach and grab everything you could, you can't get some lateral. So there's still high activity soil. So we would need that retrieval enclosure that I was talking about. So that was the big question that we looked at in our focused feasibility study was if afterward we still have to build a retrieval enclosure, do we even go forward with that original plan of using the building to support some of the soil excavation up front? So let me walk through the circular process as well. So when we discover that change condition, we don't just go out and make a decision. We have to follow circular comprehensive environmental compensation and liability act, the regulations that we follow, which EPA oversees. We got to do a focused feasibility study. What are our alternatives that we're looking at? And we identified 2 alternatives, which I'll talk about in the next slide. We evaluate those in accordance with the criteria that CERCLA outlines. There's 9 of them. 5 of them are essentially balancing criteria. You look at cost effectiveness, your schedule, your short-term effectiveness of your remedy, long-term effectiveness. But then there's 2 after that, which are public acceptance and state acceptance. So we considered the feedback that we're getting. That's the purpose here today of making sure all this is clear so you guys can provide the appropriate feedback. Consider feedback from the public, state, and tribal nations. So that and the proposed plan, that's what you guys are reviewing. There's other materials available too, which we've included in the hyperlink, which we'll talk about on the fact sheet. And then our public comment period that goes through August 18th for people to provide public comment. Once we receive all the public feedback, move forward to our next step, which is the ROD amendment. That's where DOE and EPA agree upon a path forward. EPA selects it, and then your public comments that you make, we bin those and we issue a responsiveness summary. So if you have a position like DOE, we agree, or DOE, EPA, we agree with your proposed plan, that's good. That's helpful feedback for us. DOE, EPA, we don't agree for these reasons. That's also very helpful before we make a decision. So we know the public perspective. Other helpful feedback is, hey, we feel like you guys didn't consider this alternative or didn't consider a certain approach, or you feel there's missing information or our assumptions are wrong. That's all stuff we want to hear from you and is useful to us. And that feeds into our decision-making process. So once we get those comments, we will respond to them in the responsiveness summary, which is attached to the ROD. So we looked at 2 alternatives. Both alternatives we are viable. We do have a preferred one. Yeah, they both work. The first one is the coupled approach. That's the one coupled still use the building. What would it take to be able to successfully use the equipment in the building to go excavate as much contaminated soil as we can reach? Can't get all the high activity soil. But big advantage is you can still get some of it and get it out earlier compared to the decoupled approach. So after you reach everything that you can, you move forward to your next phase, the building demolition. Went to the pictures. So this one, remote, this is where you still use the building equipment to dig up what you can below the waste site, below the hot cell. Then you jump over here, you've reached everything you can, you demolish your 324 building. And then your next stage, you build your retrieval enclosure, use remote excavation equipment as much as you can to go excavate the rod's cleanup levels, record decision cleanup levels, which are, that means essentially you've removed enough soil and contamination and conditions are safe for the public and groundwater. So that's your coupled approach. Your decoupled approach, which is the preferred one, we're essentially crossing out that entire first picture. We're going to go straight forward with demolishing the 324 building and building our retrieval enclosure and excavating all of the soil at once. So to recap, coupled, it's kind of two phases for soil excavation. Some use remote excavation equipment, demo your building, then tackle the rest under a retrieval enclosure. Whereas decoupled, you jump straight to building demo and remediate all your soil at once, which has some advantages in terms of criteria we evaluated. It was pretty safest approach for workers just because it has less industrial and radiological hazards associated with having to replace some of the equipment, failing equipment, aging equipment in the building, which I'll have some pictures on that to explain it. In terms of cost, it's a lot less because you're not having to go and do those activities I was talking about to get your aging building into a more reliable state to execute the project. And it's a lot quicker because you're not doing that upfront work. And this is just a visual of the coupled approach. So I talked about that upfront work. That's the green associated with soil excavation. Brown, you guys, it's just for information. That's the building demolition portion. But this upfront work is that almost of 3 years of prep and getting the building ready with some time to go excavate as much soil as you can reach. And it's a HAZCAT2 facility, meaning there's a lot of work to keep that building running safely. And that's just what this green bar is saying for MinSafe support. What does it take to have the building operating safely? And there's quite a cost associated with that too, for hotel load. And then this later part is building your structure, the planning, building your retrieval enclosure, and performing the final remediation. And then in summary, it takes 12 years, $438 million. Go to the next one. We noticed those green bars to do that upfront work of remote excavation, getting the building ready, digging some soil out. That is not there. You jump straight to your building demolition. While you're doing the demolition, you can plan and design for your follow-on retrieval and structure, retrieval enclosure, and remote excavation, and then go out and execute that. As I mentioned, is quicker. It's eight and a half years to do, so 3.5 years less the time, and 202 million, so over $200 million cheaper, just because you don't have all of that upfront work. All right, next one, please. So we talked about cost and schedule savings. What do we mean by it's safer for workers? So first off, any sort of work that we do out in Hanford, it's got to be safe for workers. So there's a lot of upfront planning for hazard identification. Workers at any time they don't feel safe, they can call a stop work. Doesn't matter who that worker is. And we got to stop, reassure that what we're doing is safe. So in terms of, but there can still be a safer way to do something, lower risk to the workers. And that's what the decoupled approach is. So in terms of industrial hazards, we're going to go in and replace cranes. Some of those cells are 20, or more feet tall, workers are going to be up on a scissor lift. That's just one of the example of industrial hazards. They're also in 2 pair of contamination clothing, NICs. And there's quite an amount of heat buildup. So an industrial hygiene concern where you can get overheated wearing all that equipment. And you're also wearing a hood with a air purifying respirator. Another example of industrial hazards, I talked about having to stabilize the soil. So we actually have a drill rig that was custom made to operate within the building. So industrial workers are going to be operating around a drill rig. And we had successfully used that for a number of years, but still presents a hazard. It can be mitigated, but it's there. And as you're digging into some of the contaminated soil around the hot cell, that's your radiological hazard. So if we go down the decoupled approach, we don't need any of that upfront work to get the building ready in terms of equipment for soil stabilization. This one. And then just some reassurances. How do we know that contamination hasn't moved? Well, we have monthly monitoring from, here's our 324 building. Groundwater flows this way. There's 2 wells that we monitor monthly for cesium, strontium, just checking that any other work that we're doing isn't impacting groundwater. And as I mentioned, for decades, haven't noticed any change there. Next one, please. So key takeaways. Our preferred approach is the decoupled one, safer, quicker, cheaper. And both alternatives, they do work, they are viable. So if you have a preference, remember I said the coupled approach, that would remove some of the hottest contaminated soils a couple of years quicker. But overall, the length of the project would take longer because you have that upfront work. Whereas decoupled, you're not removing any hot soil initially, but you finish the entire project quicker and get the entire waste site remediated quicker. And both are remediated to cleanup levels, to safe levels. And then building demolition activities, there's concern. You have a waste site below the building. We typically use water application for dust suppression. How are you going to protect your waste site while you're doing that? Because you told us that water is the only thing that'll move the contamination. That's all built into our planning process for demolition. In terms of would it be best to put a barrier? We manage the amount of water that would be applied. It's a pretty standard process for building demolition, contaminated waste sites. And then just as a reminder, contamination is not spreading. You're safe. So next steps, how do you guys get involved? So we're in a public 70-day public comment period. Still got some time that goes through August 18th. In the fact sheet that was provided, there's a link that you can follow, which will cover that, pointed out, and it'll take you to a document. Like there's a hyperlink on the first page, takes you straight to the proposed plan. But that first document it takes you to, for those of you who love reading, want to know more, it's called the AR Index. It shows all the documents that we looked at and developed that helps feed into our decision-making process. Proposed plan also has more references listed for those of you who really want to dig into the details. If you do have comments, please do submit those to this email address. That is the preferred way to submit comments. If you prefer to write your comments and mail them in, that is the link right there. And at the conclusion of the public comment period, we'll make our decision, but we're not going to make our decision until we hear from you guys when that public comment period closes. So you guys do have a voice. Our responsiveness summary, we'll talk about how we consider the comments that relate to this project. All right.
So real quick, I was just going to summarize a little bit about the regulatory framework around the proposed plan that you're reviewing. So as Ben mentioned, there was a record of decision in 2013, which covered all of the 300 area, which is that southernmost portion of the Hanford site. Today, we're talking specifically about a proposed plan that is focused, hence the focused feasibility study on just this particular waste site, the 300-296 waste site. So if you go back and look at the 2013 record of decision, you'll see it had hundreds of waste sites and facilities covered under that document. So when you're reviewing this, kind of keep that in the back of your mind that this is modifying that one aspect from a much larger document. So in particular, under the Superfund law, or also known as Circle L, like Ben mentioned, there are 9 criteria that are required to be evaluated. And so we have summary tables that you'll see within the proposed plan that walk you through the comparison of the 2 alternatives and also against what we had selected under the 2013 ROD to see how they are compared. And I'll say that's probably the easiest place to go to start with, where you see a summary of all 3 side by side. Because the coupled alternative looks a lot like the 2013 selected remedy, although with the new understanding now that we have to go back and reevaluate the structural design and put in place a new structure over the waste site to get the remaining contamination at the end. So at this point, no decision has been made. The public comment period that's open now will feed into one of those 9 criteria in particular, which is the community acceptance of the remedy decision. So we'll evaluate that and come to the decision, which will have the responsiveness summary and the record decision amendment, which will be issued sometime hopefully next year. And with that, I think we're ready to open it up for questions.
All right, Ben, Annie, thank you very much. Do you want to take folks through the fact sheet now real quick, or should we? Okay, just a few links that might be handy. Can you bring that up? Yeah, we're gonna bring it up here in a second. The fact sheet. And the presentation you just saw is just a quick reminder. It's on the Hanford.gov webpage. There's also hard copies here tonight if you didn't pick one up when you came in. So there's all the links that you saw here tonight are available on the website.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for waiting. We just want to show you, for those of you who haven't looked at the proposed plan yet, just an easy way to go find the link to that. Guide you through it. Should there's no questions. While you're waiting, if you got any, keep thinking about comments you may want to make, questions to ask. Because as I said, our goal was to make sure that we were clear in terms of our decision-making approach. You guys agree that this is the safest and most efficient path forward? If you don't, we'd love to hear that before we make our decision. Community acceptance is a big part of Circle L.
Right, I think we got it up here.
Yep, just as a reminder, in case we did get public comments saying, could you please extend the comment period in response to those? We kicked to that another 40 days. To give more people time to review this and provide comments. So when you first see this, we just give you kind of an intro that I just gave with the presentation. It explains, scrolling down, history of the 324 building, then over to page 2. Just a recap of summary of the 2 alternatives that we talked about. And this is all very high level. Keep going. And it's just a reminder of where you can keep going. Here we go. You can submit your comments to that email address, or if you prefer mail, you can mail them to this address. Either works. And then, sorry, our team's comments are overlaying the link. In order to find the document on this page, it's right here. So when you click on that, that's going to take you to the administration. Yeah, let's go ahead and click on it. It'll take you to the Hanford administrative record. And if we scroll down on this side, we can download that document, pretty small document, quick download. Let's go ahead and download that and open it. There we go. So that very first highlighted link, that takes you straight to the proposed plan. It's about over a 50-page document, some good reading there. For those of you who would really love to dig into some of the history behind this and the decision making, we can scroll down a bit more. So we see a table. Once again, we try to have some more text-free, explain everything, some of the history behind this and what this is. But when we get to our table, there we go, perfect. First link, these are clickable hyperlinks, same with those. Click on them, it'll go straight to the proposed plan. As part of this, for the focused feasibility study, EPA reviewed the document, they made comments. You can see how DOE and EPA worked to resolve those comments. It provides the cost files supporting our decision-making process. So you saw some big numbers. This explains justifies the reason behind those. And then it keeps going in chronological order for some stuff before that. For those of you who want to keep digging as far back as you can in the history. But as I said, the very first page is a hyperlink, take you straight to the proposed plan. All right.
All right. Thank you. All right. So let's talk about the Q&A. So we're going to dedicate the rest of the meeting to questions. We have plenty of time tonight. So what we're going to do is we're going to go back and forth between taking questions from our in-person audience and taking questions from our online participants. What I would prefer to do is, I know sometimes we get 2 or 3 part questions. We are going to have enough time if folks want to ask additional questions. We're going to go through questions one at a time. So if you could limit your question to one at a time, and then we're going to go through everybody who wants to ask a question, and then we'll circle back to folks who want to ask additional questions. So hopefully that works. I think it'll be easier to track both for our panelists and for the transcription to ensure that we get each question answered thoroughly. And if you could state your name for each question, that'll help for the transcription as well. So I think we can get going without further ado. Make sure I didn't miss any details here. Just remember again to stay muted unless you're asking a question. I will note, and Colleen will be monitoring this as well. If you want to ask the question yourself, let us know that. Otherwise, Colleen can just go ahead and read it off for our online folks and for Ben and Annie to respond to. So, all right, let's start in the room and we'll take our first question. Yes, gentleman right here. And we're gonna run a mic around so everyone can hear you. Thank you.
Thank you for this opportunity. My name is Jim Milbauer, retired Hanford worker for many years, and I don't think your method is the safest for the workers, the environment, nor the most efficient method you have not been able to do. But my question for you is, with DOE's experience on site when since been doing cleanup has been dismal at best, in my opinion, with the release of all the asbestos 9 to 13 timeframe and the uptakes and release of plutonium off and around PFP and PRF, which we heard a lot of this stuff beforehand that their method was going to work and it did not. Why are you choosing to put the containment up after demolition of the building versus containing that building first and then demolishing it within to keep the workers safe, releases, and also to keep the environment and the nearby communities safe? Thank you.
Thank you for the comment. So for the building demolition, that is a separate portion than what is captured in the circular rod. So we're focusing really on the waste site itself. But depending on how many questions we get related to that, we do look forward to those comments. See if that's something that we can respond to in detail in the responsiveness summary if it's related to the waste site.
Okay, anything to add to that, Andy?
Just real quick, I will mention that particularly from the lessons learned from the plutonium finishing plant demolition, as far as the remedial approach goes, that is part of the basis for under the coupled alternative, acknowledging that we would need a retrieval structure for the follow-on stage. I think that in a way those are linked because there was some lessons learned coming out of that demolition and the levels that were felt, to bring levels even lower for control reasons, that it would be better to do that follow-on phase under a retrieval structure. So we are considering lessons learned out of some of those previous experiences for sure. Thank you.
All right, let's take one more question from the room here before we bounce to the yes.
My name's Kaylee Coleman. I'm with Heart of America Northwest. I'm an extern there. And specifically, I wanted to ask about the decision to dispose of the waste in an ERDF rather than in a deep geological repository. We noticed that there was a letter sent from the DOE, Mark Silverstein, on the behalf of the Department of Energy to Thomas Seal, who's a representative of the Yakima Nation, who specifically mentioned that they consider the material a product rather than high-level nuclear waste. And for that reason, they weren't going to contain it in as strict of a manner. And I'm wondering, does the material below the 324 building meet the source-based definition of the high-level waste, or is the waste above Class C? And would this determination not need to be made prior to completing the ROD in order to ensure that it's handled with the care that's required?
So a few parts to the question. In terms of, for the part of the question that I can remember is, yes, there was the 2023 response from DOE to the Yakima Nation, and where we addressed that as to whether outlining our position and perspective, which was it's not high-level waste since it is multiple times removed from reprocessing. So it's that letter is actually in the administrative record index that we have pulled up, so you can see the full response there. And before we do send any waste, you mentioned Roberta, so that's our on-site circular landfill. We go through a process of developing a waste profile for the soil. So what does that mean? We have to determine that it meets our landfill or HERDIS waste acceptance criteria before we can send it there. So in terms of high-level waste, we had made that determination that it is not high-level waste, but there's a number of other check gates in there that we make sure it meets before it ever gets sent over to HERDIF and disposed of there. So, and once again, for those of you who want to know more about that, that letter is in the administrative record index hyperlink there, 2023, that you can pull up, which outline DOE's position. And please, we do look forward to that comment as part of our public comment period, so we can respond in more detail too.
All right, thank you. Let's go online. I think we have 7 or 8 questions lined up, so let's start from the top here. Here was that bring up slide 4, Justin. Thanks.
Okay. So that's from outside the facility. So as I was mentioning, before we do any work, we go through a pretty lengthy develop hazard identification process to develop the work package. So industrial hygiene looks at the work being done. And then also radiological control technicians and engineers look at that. So they determine if our conditions going to be at a certain level to where workers would need to wear PPE or not. That's explained to the workers, and if they disagree or have concerns, that's, I mentioned, anyone can call, stop work. But conditions were not at the level where it was required for the respiratory PPE. I believe that was taking the soil sample back in 2011. So as they're pulling out pipe, it goes into that enclosure there. The soil samples captured.
All right, let's take one more online.
Can we actually go to the retrieval enclosure picture? Over on that slide. There we go. So how are workers protected? So in this scenario, these excavators are actually remotely operated. This is the control room right here, where to the degree we can, everything's going to be done remotely. And this is once again in the retrieval enclosure. Workers, if it's determined through that planning process, as I mentioned, where they're in two pair and the appropriate respirator if necessary, it will be in that. But to the maximum amount that we can apply a LARA, as low as reasonably achievable in terms of dose rates to workers and any sort of respiratory protection, that'll be employed in that structure.
All right, let's take one more online while we're on a roll here.
Well, the next this question, I thought I heard you say that contamination reached 3 feet for CS 137 and 8 feet for SR 90. Did I mishear or did you mean meters?
Oh, you're correct. So if we can go back to the previous slide. One more, actually. So this is talking to the original approach based on the data that was collected in 2011 and 2013 timeframe. So as probes are going beneath here, they're checking dose rates. So if you the more beeps you hear, the higher the amount of radioactivity it is. And they measure that and convert it to a number. And PNNL, Pacific Northwest National Laboratory, they help model that into a full depiction of what your waste site looks like. And they're based on the data that they were given, they said cesium, the maximum or highest concentrations go down to about 3 feet. Your strontium goes down to about 6 to 8 feet. Cesium binds up in the soil first, that's why it doesn't go as far. But that was essentially the dimensions of the waste site that we were working according to for getting out the high activity portion. Are there lower concentrations below that? Yes, and that was part of the phase 2 of the original approach, where you could go address that low activity contamination, open air, which is a lot quicker, cheaper, and easier. But based on that new data, it was determined can't do that open air. There's some, we can't get all the high activity soil out, so we do need that retrieval enclosure for safety.
All right, back to the room here. More questions in the room. Yes.
Hello, I'm Megan Brown. I'm also with Heart American Northwest as a legal extern. Currently, the industrial standard is the cleanup standard 300 area. So this would leave much more contamination in the soil compared to the residential standard due to the expectation that we would not live on the land. Could you explain why the industrial standard was chosen, especially considering the city of Richland has it in their comprehensive plan to eventually residentially develop the area, and the Yakama Nation has treaty rights to the resources on the land and the Columbia River?
So I can't speak to that in detail. I can say that Hanford's comprehensive land use plan outlines some of the different zones, whether it's industrial versus residential. So please, if you can make that comment during the public comment period, formally submit that. That's one we can definitely respond to. It's applicable. And
So we do also have, the vast majority of the area of the 300 area is, if you go back to the 2013 record decision, we actually include the same cleanup table, cleanup levels table in this set of documents again as an appendice, so you can go there too. The majority of the 300 area was cleaned up to the residential standards, and a small area, particularly where there's a large Pacific Northwest National Lab ongoing mission, is being cleaned up to the industrial levels. So I just wanted to clarify that the majority of the 300 area is actually zoned residential for cleanup purposes. Although obviously currently none of the groundwater is being used as drinking water, but we do clean up even under the industrial standards. It's all to the same groundwater standards. So to the drinking water standards of that.
All right, let's take one more question in the room here, if we have one. Yeah, Jerry.
Thank you. Jerry Paulette, Heart of America Northwest. I want to start by thanking you for extending the comment period. The questions we have and others have show the need for reviewing materials further and basing comments after discussion and things we learned tonight. So thank you for doing that. And secondly, thank you for making it much more clear how people can find the proposed plan. So 2 minutes for appreciation. I was surprised in reading the proposed plan feasibility study, given the levels of gamma radiation present, that there is no modeling of radiation dose levels to the public, for instance, using the shoreline. And as a reminder, while the Energy Department has previously said, we keep people off the shoreline, et cetera, you don't own, the state owns up to the high water mark and it's public access. Tribes have treaty rights to utilize the shoreline, public uses the shoreline. So there doesn't seem to be any modeling of gamma radiation levels from the excavation. The tent isn't going to stop them. A burn isn't going to stop them. And there is no discussion or modeling of the worker dose. And in your schematic, it shows the worker staging area in between burns for a direct line of gamma radiation. I know that's just the schematic, but there is nothing detailed at all to show that this plan is going to meet, while being undertaken, the human health protectiveness criteria of CERCLA. And that is very, very worrisome. And I'd like to ask where that modeling is. And for example, have you given the lessons we had from the N reactor discharge cribs with high levels of radiation from the soil in the crib bouncing across to the river and dosing people for decades? Have you thought about, is there, as part of the plan, will you use concrete shielding over the areas that you're not immediately excavating on a given day? Did you consider an alternative as well of putting a tent over the entire building prior to demolition, to go to the point about what we've seen over and over again is massive, significant releases of uncontrolled contamination during demolition activities for other buildings. So assurances don't ring very assuringly. Thank you.
yeah, thank you, Jerry. And let me know if I missed, that was a multi-part question, so let me know if I missed any parts of it. But in terms of the initial question of how are we protecting workers, so and you said, where can we go and look to see some of that information? So this is still at the conceptual phase, but it's still something we have to consider as we go out and plan this. So in the two ECF files, it does have some detail in there for more of the steps that we go through in the planning process, and soil cover is used for shielding, so kind of like a cap over a waste site to shield the gamma radiation and limit worker exposure. But that's a physical barrier in place. So what's a better way to keep workers safe is the remote excavation equipment. So to the greatest extent possible, workers are kept away from that. Now, workers that are in the tent, if planning determines that's safe, how do we monitor that? So we have TLDs or dosimeters that monitor dose to workers. We have active dosimeters that monitor dose rates that workers are receiving. Kind of the radiation field, is it safe? We have finger rings, so there's multiple ways to monitor to make sure that the planning that says a worker can receive this much, we expect to receive this much because that's a determined safe limit. Those monitoring systems are in place to keep people safe, and that'll be used. Trying to remember the rest of the question.
Can I just, you didn't address it all. Where's the modeling in terms of the public goes, which we know there will be as uncovers high levels of gamma radiation in the soil. So, like, for the audience, the part of the question about public dose and modeling to assure that we're not exposing people to gamma radiation, including from bounce and shine, essentially, which in the past, for example, for ditches from the N reactor discharge, the radiation levels bounced basically from the gamma radiation to be measurable significantly above any protective criteria all the way across the river. So how are we going to, where's the modeling for that? And the other part of the question to come back to, and I can return later to this, is the demolition itself and protectiveness.
Let's hit the modeling one and then we'll circle back on that.
This is, as Ben mentioned, this is the early phase of the process, right? So that we essentially right now have not designed what's going to look like inside of the as we call it, kind of a tent structure, but it's a protective structure, and it will absolutely have to incorporate an entire shielding design. And there's a whole nuclear safety design that will have to be generated as part of this, which includes the modeling of how the radiation is controlled, the values inside of the work, how much can they put in a certain waste package, all of that stuff comes later. And I know that's not the answer you'd like to hear, but that is how the process works. We have to select which path we're headed towards and then develop those details in the safe process that follows it. If you'll see in the schedule, they take a significant amount of time to come up with those designs and work through all of the details. So there will be a lot more details that can be shared in the future at other public venues, but right now it's still the very early phase. So even in terms of like the air monitoring plan, we're looking to update for the building demolition planning. That's one aspect, right, of protecting the public as well. It would be looking at our controls that are in place for any possible air releases. And that is specific to the building demolition, which is not the main focus of this meeting because that is under a separate regulatory process, actually.
All right, let's go back.
You might have added.
Yeah, go for it, of course.
So definitely, if you're not satisfied with the response, please submit that as a formal public comment. But just as a reminder, as we go through this process of evaluation of the proposed plan, we can't propose something that's not safe. So we did mention the soil cover for shielding, and as Andy said, as we get further along into the soil excavation design, that helps inform us how much soil can we uncover. before there's a certain amount of gamma shine. This is also the waste site sits 10 feet below ground, and that radiation travels in a straight line. So if you're already 10 feet below ground and you have berms, that'll provide your shielding for public protection. But I see you're looking for kind of the more detailed analysis. So from a straightforward perspective, we're able to screen and determine that it was safe, but those detailed evaluations with exact numbers will be available at a later point.
All right, thanks for that question, Jerry. So let's go back to our chat, and it looks like this one might be a long one too. Okay.
Thank you, Ben and Annie, for your presentation tonight. And Colleen, I have more questions, so if you can just put me at the end of the queue, please. But when I was reviewing the proposed plan in comparison to the focused feasibility study, I thought it was interesting that you added 2 years to both of the approaches. So in the focused feasibility study, the coupled approach was 10 years, and in the proposed plan it's 12. And then the decoupled approach went from 6.5 years to 8.5 years as like a total duration. And it seemed like those extra years were added to the demolition. And I was just wondering if you could talk about that a little, why it changed, why each one is made longer.
So it sounds like the version of the focused feasibility study that you reviewed was the draft A. So in between, as we go through our document development process, we have an initial version which is sent to EPA. We review it, resolve comments, check things over. As part of that process, we identified some extra steps that were added in, needed to be added in. And that's what that change in time frame is. So all the finalized documents are consistent with the timeframes that we're proposing today.
I was just gonna add, so those 2 years were primarily associated with the monolith disposition, which is still undergoing design right now. So again, that's part of the demolition process, which is not our focus today. However, the schedule does get affected by what the demolition will take. And so the thinking is that the building demolishment will be the outer portions that are all more or less non-rad and have really been significantly decontaminated as well from things like asbestos and other hazards already. And then you'll be left with these big hot cells to deal with that are the large concrete structures. And that's a whole separate activity as part of the demolition. And so that's the reason for that big change from the draft day to the Rev 0 if you look at both versions.
Thank you, that's super helpful.
All right, let's stick with our chat. Next question.
It's a longer question, but it provides comments. So it says, with the newer sampling data showing contamination is more extensive and concentrated than thought back in the 2013, is it not possible that the mass of contaminants in the subsurface is greater than thought? If so, is the chance for partitioning of Betos zone contamination to groundwater similarly greater than originally thought?
So yes, with the additional hotspot that we found in that area, in terms of the massive contamination is greater, still within the building foundation. So completely covered, kind of like protective cap over the waste site. But in terms of partitioning between the Betos zone and groundwater, maybe he can expound on that. I'm not sure what that means unless you know it.
Thanks. I'm not sure you're able to identify. Okay, go ahead.
You got the drill? Wow. Well, anything, it would be fishing with groundwater get evaluated, and so evaluated, why not? Hey, you guys are the right people, the groundwater experts, to take a look at this.
That's a great question. I will say right now with the building over it, that there is no driving force essentially. So that's the primary reason that right now we're not viewing the different configuration of the contamination as a change in the risk. But as part of the, particularly the demolition planning, depending on which alternative we go with, may change what that needs to look like, what monitoring do we need in place, what controls do we need in place, what potential protective measures need to be kept in place so that we do continue to have no driving force to move that contamination.
All right, let's go back to the room here if we have additional questions. Yes, right here. On the mic to you.
Thanks a lot. I believe this waste site needs to be cleaned up, so I appreciate that there's action moving forward on it. I'm also interested in the groundwater. Has the plan to dig up this waste site been evaluated by a hydrogeologist? There's seasonal changes in the river that affect the groundwater, pretty close to the river. And what will be your plan if you do see an uptick in those contaminants at your watering wells? That sort of thing.
So just real quick, I was going to mention, so after the 2013 ROD was in place, we went under remedial design, remedial action planning, and there was a significant modeling study, and that you can get to the report through the administrative record from Pacific Northwest National Lab, looking at the mobility of this waste site and also how moisture in the soils affected it. And it's incredibly detailed. I haven't looked at it in a while, all of it. So I do recommend seeking that out if you're interested. It is not current. Of course, it doesn't have the most recent data that we've collected from the soils, but it does have all of the data up through, I think, about 2014 or 2015. So it has a pretty good basis, though, to give you an understanding of how this material could potentially be driven and what types of evaluate some of those things that were already done, because now we have a slightly different configuration and we have different planning, assumptions, and we're going to have to go back and reevaluate some of those things. But that original PNL study does have a lot of information in there about that piece of it. Yeah.
All right, next question from the room here. Yeah, we'll go back to.
Thank you. Kaylee Coleman again. Hi. I wanted to specifically go back to the question of whether this is high level waste, speaking to the EPA's point of view. Considering that the radiation is so high with this waste material, is it also the EPA's view that this is a product, not high level waste, and thus shouldn't be disposed of within a deep geological repository?
So a couple parts in there. So in terms of the levels of contamination, the radiological levels, under CERCLA, we clean up to 1 × 10⁻⁶ risk, cancer risk levels for radionuclides. And so based off of what the contamination is, that's how we've developed our cleanup levels. And then after we've cleaned up the soils, we'll verify against those levels. So the separate question about the product aspect, the Department of Energy is the authority under the Atomic Energy Act who makes those determinations, and that's a source-based determination that EPA does not really have a role within. And then as far as the ERDF facility, we mentioned earlier, so that has waste acceptance criteria. And so the material to be able to be disposed at our circular landfill does have to meet those levels and be within the criteria for disposal there, which includes that it has to be not greater than Class C material.
All right, let's jump back to the chat.
So our next question is from Kathleen. Kathleen, do you want to unmute, ask your question?
Yeah, can you hear me?
I can hear you, thanks.
Excellent. I don't have a question. This stuff is way over my head, so I have nothing intelligent to say other than to say thank you. I'm really grateful that you're attending to this matter, working on it diligently after all these years. And thanks to Jerry and the people at Hanford American Northwest, people at the Columbia River Keeper, and everyone who's advocating. People of the Agawam Nation and surrounding tribes, everyone's advocating for cleanup of this amazing sacred ground on this planet who is so prolifically with our ambitions to get ahead, have progress. And we can just settle down a little bit, but we created this mess, and I'm so grateful that you're working on it now, to figure it out. Hopefully we'll do better in the future. So thank you so much. I mean, I can't begin to address these issues. I'm just grateful for the people who've done the school, done the studies, and got the knowledge to at least try, right? So that's it. Thank you so much, all of you.
Yes, thank you for sharing your perspective and the fact that it is indeed a priority for you, so that we're aware of that. And we do appreciate the appreciation because we do spend a lot of time ensuring that from our perspective it is being done safely, efficiently, because we live here too. Thank you.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Take care.
All right, next question, Colleen. Yeah, let's stick.
Second question, because I don't see any other first two questions. So we're going back to Michael Freeman. And Michael Freeman's follow-up question. Will the site be excavated to the surplus specified depth or until the soil radiation has dropped below the specified level? And then attached to that question, while not filling the material is spreading, is there measurable cesium or strontium contamination monitoring wells in 16?
Okay, now I forgot the first part of the question though.
That's the problem with the two-part one.
You better read it again.
Say a tiny part of it, then I'll.
Will the site be excavated to the surplus?
Okay, good. So there's the cleanup levels for, I think what he's referencing is if you go to the table that lists all the cleanup levels, which is a very lengthy, large table, for the industrial zone, it says that we have a soil cleanup value in picocuries per gram, each for cesium, and then a value for strontium down to 15 feet below grades from the ground surface. This site's a little nuanced because we're not going to stop at 15 feet. If we were, there would be no decoupled alternative, basically. And we wouldn't be putting up a structure, and we would just be leaving a lot of material in place. There's a couple of issues with that. One, this contamination, as we've mentioned, is highly radioactive. So there's no interest, of course, in leaving that there in the long term and having to babysit it. It would not be safe. We, under CERCLA, designated the term for that is principal threat waste. which means, and you'll see that within the proposed plan language. I think it's mentioned a couple of times in there. And what that means is that this is a significant hazard that we should clean up. So it's not a value, it's more of a qualitative term, that this is a significant amount of contamination that should be addressed. So we have two things. We have a cleanup level that's been specified under the ROD that we're continuing to work towards. But as I mentioned earlier about verification sampling after we remediate the soils, that includes an analysis of whether it would be safe to groundwater, in the long term. And so if we were to leave a large amount of material in place at 15 feet below ground surface and said, yeah, these are not the most mobile contaminants, to be clear, we have much more mobile contaminants on site. We would have to put in place a more robust institutional control program and potentially some engineered barriers, and it would pile on to become a much more long-term problem. So that's a very long way of saying that it's neither. It's not a number, a dose reading, and it's not just the cleanup level down to 15 feet and stop. It's going to be a combination of the two. And what we've discussed and what's been used for the cost analysis, if you look within the ECE and ECF documents on the index, is a value of 1 R per hour, which is a dose value. It's not a soil cleanup value, but it gives you an idea of have you remediated the vast majority of this waste site all the way to depth below the 15 feet, at which point we can do the verification sampling and verification modeling to see if it meets those safe levels. So it's a very complicated process that includes potentially some, it's kind of like, guess and check, but it's a very fancy guess and check version of that. I don't know, hopefully that makes sense and helps.
And just to add on to that, in the end, as Annie said, we have to sample, and we can't stop at a point to where it is not protective of human health and groundwater. We have to go to excavate until it is protective of human health and groundwater. And we check that through the soil sampling, soil verification sampling that we do, get a value. Is that safe? If it is, and we meet the cleanup levels, we're able to stop. And I can answer, I got the second part written down. When we go to the groundwater monitoring slide, real quick.
Dustin, okay.
Keep going. So the question was, if I recall correctly, is there cesium and strontium in the groundwater? There we go. So 324 building, those are the two downstream wells that we monitor monthly. So even though we've monitored for decades, haven't seen any movement, this is where we would see contamination show up if we were to get there. From cesium, there is historic cesium strontium contamination in the 300 area. That area was used for research of nuclear materials. Upstream of 324 in the 70s, there was a spike of strontium contamination to the groundwater. So in terms of, is there stuff there? Yes, there is. And what we check is anything that we're doing causing that to fluctuate. So the strontium levels that we see, it's below drinking water standard, meaning it is safe in terms of drinking water. You can drink it, this is safe levels. But is it from the 324 building? No, it's from upstream of there, which is something we do monitor and check. Cesium, that is below detect. So when you, sounds like the individual is familiar with the monitoring wells. When you look at the graphs, which we make publicly available, all that data is available. You can see that it shows non-detect. So for anyone who wants to know more and inquire more about the wells, those are the well numbers, and you can submit those comments and try to get back to you in more detail, unless you can come up with a question now.
All right, lots of good questions tonight. Why don't we go back to the room, see if we've got additional questions here? Yeah, Jerry.
I really feel as a person who teaches public health at the University of Washington, I need to comment, Ben, and ask you never to say that a carcinogen is safe to drink. There is no safe level of cesium in water any more than there would be for lead in water. And it may be below the drinking water standard, but it is not appropriate to ever say it is quote, safe. There is a risk factor, and I just would urge you to think about, saying it's below the drinking water standard. That standard assumes that 1 adult of every 10,000 exposed to it will get cancer. There are more vulnerable populations. So and that's just one contaminant from the site. There are others. Uranium above drinking water standard, all in combination. So it would be really erroneous for someone to think that drinking water out of a well on this site, although it's not feasible now, but it would be 10 years, 100 years from now, that is not safe. So I just appreciate sharing that. And I do want to ask if I understood correctly, and you're saying that right now the plan is what it appeared to be, and I feared that you don't have a cleanup remediation level lower than 1 R per hour. Okay, if you could explain, because I just want to be clear for the public what that means. 1 R or 1 doesn't sound like a lot, but that's 1,000 millirem per hour. That would be 5,680,000 millirem per year. And to meet that circular protectiveness level, we are at generally 3 to 5 millirem per year, versus this would be soil at 5,680,000. So I'd appreciate it if you could clarify.
Yeah, so the soil cleanup levels for the upper 15 feet are way below 1 R per hour. But they're in picocuries per gram, and I have to tell you, it's some really complicated science to switch between those units. But those values are listed within the cleanup levels table. And then below 15 feet, though, there will be an analysis done. And as we discussed, it may not be 1 R per hour, that's the number. But we're using that number for estimation purposes because it gives you an idea right now from the readings we have of the general kind of volume, right, that we'll be digging up. And so it was really used for cost estimation purposes. That is not cleanup level. The verification sampling and verification modeling after the fact will be what verifies if we've gone far enough or we need to keep digging. But the cleanup levels themselves are way below 1 R per hour.
I'm sorry, but I'm just not quite following this. So the record decision and the cleanup levels are for the first 15 feet, right? Okay, yes. All right. So how do we examine and comment if the plan is going to leave contamination, carcinogen, gamma radiation, direct exposure risk, if pulled up to the soil or an excavation or something? How will we comment on a proposed cleanup plan without knowing what the proposed cleanup remedial action goal is for below 15 feet and what the modeling is for ensuring that no one will ever be exposed to a risk above the sort of protective level? We should be able to see that in record decision. And it was in there for the 300 area generally, because you said we're going to leave stuff below 15 feet. We don't think anyone's going to be exposed, but that didn't take into account that you've got extremely high levels of gamma radiation, even at below 1 R per hour, 5,680,000 millirem per year, which is incredibly dangerous.
So in terms of what we provided in there, we did pull out the cleanup levels from the rod, and on that table it shows at this depth, here's the cleanup level you need to meet, and we're digging down to at least that depth. And past that, it's good. It switches over to protection of groundwater. So if we're digging down to a certain depth, it's going to be, and we're backfilling that with soil. We're not leaving the waste site exposed to open air at the low, anything below cleanup level that's not exposed to open air. So if it makes sense, that hole is covered up. We need backfill, so there's no exposure pathway there. At that point, your only exposure pathway is through groundwater, which we verify. We have to verify that we're not going to have any sort of threat. It's got to be safe for protection of people and the environment. So if that's not quite adequately addressing where you're going, we definitely look forward to that question and to respond to that in more detail.
All right, let's take one more from the room if we have any. Yes, ma'am.
Question about it being considered high-level waste and going into ERDF. What's the procedure along the way to make sure that it's meeting the ERDF WAC criteria?
So that all starts off, we've talked about the data that we've collected in the past. So 2 soil samples were collected from below the waste site. Yes, 2 soil samples. My activity, PNL was able to process those soil samples and tell us what the contaminants were in there. So that gives us a profile of which contaminants are in the soil. We use that to determine kind of what we're dealing with in the soil, and we have to do an evaluation before we ship it to ERDF. Is what we have, is it safe to transport? It's got to be below a certain level for protection of the workers, protection of the driver. It's got to be in a configuration that's safe for storage in ERDF. And that's all part of the waste acceptance criteria that we've been talking about. Essentially a checklist that we have to go, DOE develops, sent over to EPA, that evaluation. So it's got to go through that entire process before it ever gets to ERDF, because we can't send a waste package there that, or create a waste package that doesn't have a disposal pathway for this waste site. So we talked about the verification sampling. So we're able to check that we're stopping at the right level, but it sounds more like you're asking, how do you check to make sure that the contaminants in the soil haven't changed? Is that where you're going with it? Okay. So. Yeah. So part of that is we're able to remotely monitor dose rates coming from the soil. So the radiation levels, the radiation signature, that gives us an idea of what we're dealing with and the levels. So that's something we've actively employed for stuff that we're pulling out of the building. We're able to check levels, make sure it's safe to package. If it's something that's a bit higher activity, more radiation, well, then you put less of that in a container that goes to ERDF so that it's below a safe, it's at a safe level to ship. So that's all part of the shipping, evaluation, and processing. It's pretty easy to check the dose rates, which is good.
All right. Thank you for that question. Just a quick time check, and we didn't put an end time on this meeting, but it is like just after 7. So also want to be respectful of people's time tonight. I understand we have several questions left on the chat. Okay, so let's hear from Dan.
This question is, how does the presence of uranium in the groundwater influence cleanup decisions at 324? Since wells downgrading from 324 have gradient of the MCL, will that 324 cleanup impact the ability?
So we talked about the soil samples that were taken. Uranium is not present in any appreciable quantities. That's not one of our main constituents that we're dealing with at the waste site. It's mainly cesium, strontium, respectively very low amounts in comparison of americium, plutonium. So what we're doing here isn't gonna release anything.
I was just gonna add to that too, the I can't the right term, but the protection of the waste site itself means that we're not going to be having significant water additions. That is going to have to be very detailed planning to make sure that any water additions are controlled. So in terms of potential for pushing the uranium plume or changing how the uranium's sitting in the Vados zone or anything like that, we're at a distance, as Ben mentioned, from the uranium, not a significant different distance, we are at a distance from it. And we are going to already need to be controlling all of the water additions because of the waste site itself. So all of that will be considered under the protection that gets put in place during the remedial process.
All right, next question.
There's one particular question you have for follow-up question, James. And you can go ahead and ask. Okay, I think
I would say if you do have any formal public comments, if you could submit those to the email address that we provided. Because after this meeting ends, I don't think we're sticking around to address additional questions, but that is something that if they're relevant and appropriate, we definitely respond to those as part of our responsiveness summary. So please do submit those to the email address or mail them in if you prefer.
And James, I didn't intend to rush the meeting here, just noting the time. So if you want to ask your question tonight, this is a good time to do it. We have the time to do that with Ben and Annie here. Let's go to the next question, and then we can circle back to James.
So how you'll be protecting workers when they're in the superstructure from extreme temperatures, specifically hot and cold, especially when they're wearing PPE and supplied air. And then Ben, I know you mentioned during your presentation that there have been other superstructures like this used at Hanford. I was just curious if you could give some examples, just because I'm not familiar with any of them.
So how do we protect workers? So industrial hygiene, that is something where we actually have active sensors placed on the workers when they're in the two pair of, they're called NICs, essentially. They could be very thick cloth or a type of plastic, in some cases impermeable if you don't want water getting through, but it can get hot. So that device that is put on workers checks heart rate, checks temperature. So it's through that active monitoring. In terms of if it's a certain temperature, the industrial hygienist, there's a certain amount of time a worker is allowed to work before they're told to stop and rest. So there are a number of precautions in place for keeping the workers safe. I forget the second question.
You mentioned that there were other superstructures like this used at Hanford, and I'm curious where those were for what cleanup projects?
Off the top of my head, I can't tell you the project, but along the river corridor, that is something that was used. Those type of temporary structures were set up, and with the membrane, they were able to withstand the winds. They're able to provide containment, and we actually do still have some of those that are used. I know the Pump and Treat has one for where that was being used. So I would say one of the best resources if you want to know more about those. We did cite in the proposed plan, the feasibility study, specifically Idaho's use of those, because that's also a big part of our future design is how do they also effectively use those. So there are citations provided if you'd like to know more about that type of structure.
Thank you.
All right, let's stick with the chat for one more. We did that.
Taking the time to answer our questions. We really appreciate that. The main thing that I feel like I'm struggling with is trying to actually compare what is safer for workers between two options. And with the limitations on talking about how building demolition will work, it makes it really hard to actually compare. I feel like I have a better idea with the couple of approaches just from hearing about the mock-up facility and some of the work that was going to be happening to remove contamination prior to demolishing the building. But I'm still struggling to understand what exactly happened. The work stopped, and I read the proposed plan. Are all of the hot cells still in grout, and then the building's knocked down, and then you're using, like, how are you getting contamination out? I'm still, it's hard to imagine, like, what are workers actually doing beyond digging soil, and, you know, if they're encountering problems, then what does that look like? It feels very vague compared to what information's been out there. I know you helped design that, but I think it'd be really helpful to have more information about the decoupled approach to actually be able to compare how it's safer for workers. Thanks.
No, that's a good question. Thank you for asking. So in terms of the coupled and decoupled, right now you can go in the building, stand around B cell, and you are completely shielded from the waste site as is. I've been down there observing work. So that the soil, the foundation for B cell, that gives you your shielding. So from the perspective of getting some soil out earlier, it doesn't impact the worker protection factor for during building demolition. There's still that shielding in place. Conceptual design, as you mentioned, there would be grout in the hot cells for shielding, additional shielding. But so I hope that helps explain a little bit in terms of the protection factor. The difference is that soil foundation provides all their shielding. Have anything you wanted to add, Annie?
Primarily, I just wanted to add that I would recommend if there's an aspect that you feel like wasn't detailed enough in here and it may affect your ability to weigh in one way or the other or submit it as a comment. I think that alone is valuable too.
All right. Thank you, Liz. Let's go back to the room.
Has a coupled/decoupled approach been analyzed, meaning like maybe you take down most of 324 and leave the monoliths, then build your retrieval structure, then take out the monoliths and clean up the soil?
Who's getting the microphone first? So I'm gonna just say again, yes and no. So what we are not designing the demolition under this alternatives analysis, but that's where there's a point where, of course, what you leave from the demolition becomes your starting point for the waste site, right? And so there is work being done right now to tie those two phases of the work together. I'm definitely not an expert in that part of the process. However, I do know that the folks that are planning the monolith demolition or the design for being able to manage that are also essentially designing the first phase of what would be left behind when you start the remediation. And of course, if they determine that there's a significant, airborne radiation risk or potential for contamination spread, they may say, actually, this is the stopping point, and that is when we construct the structure. So those two phases are being considered in construction right now, but that work is still ongoing. That planning is still ongoing.
All right, anything else from the room here? You guys have the floor. All right, let's go back to the chat. I think we have two more.
But while he's doing that, we have James leave a comment to say thank you. And the extended comment period will be helpful for the public rights and local governments to provide comments and durations. So Michael, did you have a question? I know there was a comment about the depth of the cell.
Okay.
Then Liz Matson said.
Is there a question of the depth of
There
base?
wasn't, it was a comment just kind of talking about, let's see, the bottom of the cell is 13.5 feet below ground. So the first 15 is going to be 1.5 feet taller.
Okay, and that's part of what Andy was talking about for our estimate, so we're going under 32 feet in the cost class.
So Liz did say if there's time, she had another question about the volume of material to dig up.
So in terms of the volume, sorry, asking a question.
Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead, Liz.
There's a lot of uncertainty about the decoupled approach, like what's actually happening. Because we could have, just be really helpful to have more information about that. But I'm curious about how the volume of waste that needs to be dug up changes between the two options. If you end up with a bigger volume of waste that goes to urgent, or there's less, like between a coupled and decoupled approach. And really, it seems like maybe in my head it's like quite a terrible metaphor. I'm inside a cup digging up something, and then I knock down the cup and I dig up some more, versus I knock down the cup and I dig up the kind of stuff. Is there more in the decoupled approach, or do you even know?
So there would be more in the decoupled approach. So I talked about, there was a question on, how do you protect the public? And part of that is using clean fill as shielding. So as we determine, as we do the decoupled, we cover the waste site with clean fill. We excavate a mixture of clean fill on top of the 300 296 waste site. So there is some mixing there to provide shielding and reduce dose rate. So from that perspective, you would have more in terms of an overall volumetric amount. The 296 waste site is relatively small considering compared to some other waste sites on site. So it's not an appreciable difference. But to answer your question, yeah, there would be a bit more for decouple.
All right, any other comments come through the chat?
So Michael, are you able to unmute?
I think so now.
Okay, there you go.
So as I read CERCLA, it appears to say that you cannot consider climate change as part of the criteria. I look at the two main radionuclides here with their 30-year half-life. It suggests that this stuff is going to be hazardous for far longer than any of us are going to be alive. I don't see many people projecting climate that far out. I mean, they talk about how the sulfur may stop and how that would dramatically change the amount of rainfall here in the Northwest. When you consider how much you leave behind, is there any consideration at all that the Columbia might turn into a raging torrent up there and be able to sweep across this old alluvial bed?
I think that's
That was the question, I think.
I'd have to check if that specific scenario was evaluated. So if you wouldn't mind submitting that as a formal comment, I can check with the appropriate risk assessors. Do you have anything in it?
Yeah, the only other thing I would point you to look at as well as the performance assessment for the environmental restoration disposal facility, the ERDF. That looks at a longer time frame for how the facility is designed. It's a RCRA compliant landfill in terms of the design of it, and it has a assumed 500-year hydrologic protection time frame. So that 30-year half-life actually does make a big difference because it does show that a lot of this material will have to decay within the assumed time frame that design of the landfill is intact. And within those performance assessments, I believe they do a pretty significant, like kind of Monte Carlo analysis of various weather events. But again, I recommend you to look at that document for more information.
That's up on the plateau.
Yeah, that's where the disposal, that's where this material that's excavated would go to. Yeah, but as far as what's left behind, the protectiveness criteria and the evaluation that's done is based off of, the soil conditions that are in place. Yeah, you submit the comment, we can provide more detailed response.
All right, one more sweep here, going back to the room. Final comments, questions? Okay.
So over here online, we have a clarifying question from Liz Madsen and then one more question from Dan Saris.
All right.
So Liz, did you want to ask your clarifying question about the clean bill shielding?
Yeah, thanks. And thanks for sharing. Thanks for keep asking questions. I'm trying to understand the clean bill shielding. How that logistically works, because at some point you're gonna dig and then there won't be shielding. So is there a way to be injecting clean fill constantly, or is it a giant? How do you do that?
So the ECF, the cost files essentially go into a bit more detail about that. But the way I explained it is, so you cover your waste site with the clean fill that provides your shielding, and then you essentially dig in strips. So as you dig a spot, you get a mixture of clean fill, some contaminated soil. When you're done in that spot, fill it back up and you move to your next strip. And as we mentioned earlier, that's done with the remote excavators to the maximum extent practicable. So there's no operators around. But that, as soon as you get your strip mined, you fold back in to cover up what's below there, and you move horizontally across. So you're going in layers horizontally. Then when you're done with that, you move down to your next layer in depth wise. That's the best way I can explain it. And
I just want to say that's also a conceptual idea of how this will work. That was what was done for cost estimating purposes to come up with how that affects the volume of the soils. And it was something that has been done elsewhere. I don't remember where the examples were, but if you were interested, submit the comment, we can provide that back if it's not referenced in the cost files.
And for Dan?
And then Dan Sarah's, let's see, I was going to read it, and then he rephrased it. Will the Hanford Air Operating Permit process provide any opportunity to learn more about 324 in terms of ambient air monitoring? He says he seconds what Liz said, if you were offering so much information in this chapter.
I'm going to ask if anyone from Ben Franklin Health is on the line, because they would be the best people to answer that. Probably not. So there is a Hanford General Air Operating Permit that he's referencing, and we are in discussions with the Ben Franklin Health District, and they're going to provide. They have some external monitoring points that they kind of second check, provide a more independent look separate from the Hanford tri-parties. And so in that way, I would say that their general air monitoring would provide us some additional data. But we'll have our own separate, as part of the demolition plan and air monitoring plan, and under the remedial process, we have our own air monitoring plan. So there will be specifically for these actions, CERCLA air monitoring programs as well.
Okay, we'll go to a final call here. Final call on the chat, final call in the room. Okay. Ben, Annie, any final closing thoughts, comments?
Well, thank you to everyone who came and stayed this long. That's amazing, and had so many wonderful questions. Really appreciative. This is the whole point of us sitting here all night, is to have some wonderful conversations and hear from all of you. So thank you again, and we look forward to getting your comments submitted formally so that we can review them and come up with a solid broad amendment. Thank you.
Likewise, just to echo the appreciation. We put over a year of work into coming up with the proposed plan. So to see the level of public interest in reviewing this, I know it's not the funnest information to read, but thank you for your attention to that. Being willing to take part of your time to come let us know what your perspectives are, what your thoughts are, and to learn more. And like Annie said, if there's anything that we can answer in the appropriate level of detail, or you got more questions, please submit those. And once the ROD amendment is finalized, those will come out as part of that in the responsiveness summary. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Thank you, Ben, Annie. Thank you, everyone, again, for being here. On my rough count, there was over 70 people here tonight, both in the room and online. So it's a great turnout for a Hanford meeting. Thanks again. I believe there's a survey that was dropped in the chat. There's also a survey that you can get via a QR code here. So if you wouldn't mind giving us some feedback on how the meeting went, any comments about how we could improve for the next time, we do appreciate that feedback as well. So again, comment period's open through August 18th. Look forward to seeing those. And that's a wrap. Have a good evening, everyone.